Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us for our coffee talk. And it's titled Meeting in the Middle, How Community and Autonomy Work Together. So hopefully we have a great conversation. How many of you are in the autonomy business, just to kind of get a gauge? Wonderful. Okay, so some in the audience, the lights a little bit. All right. So as we all know, obviously, we're all related. We're all in the mobility business. The autonomous vehicle technology is commonly understood as the playground for pushing the edge of cities, of efficiency, connected and automated ways. But ultimately, as we've talked a lot about in the last 2 days, transportation is about moving people, and it's about moving people and goods and getting us to the places that we live, we work, and we play in. So what are the implications of all of this for those people that we're trying to move around or those people that are working to move those goods? How is the community incorporated into the vision of a hyper-connected future? And what can autonomous or vehicle-based transit systems do for travelers and build trust among citizens, technologists, and maybe even government? So we're going to try and tackle a couple of those topics in a very short amount of time. I'd love to introduce our panelists. So to my far left is Jerry He, who's the Executive Director of CARTS. And we also have Yasmine Fage, who is with GoGo Systems. So why don't we each do a little bit of a round of introductions about who you are and how you got here.
Sure. Thanks, Lilian. Great to be here. Thanks, John and the CoMotion team for putting everything together. Fantastic. Thank you. My name is Jerry. I am the Executive Director of CARTS. We are a New Jersey-based nonprofit fully dedicated to the safe and high-quality mobility for all. And we facilitate between the government, the academia, the industry, and community to really shape the deployment of mobility innovations. And one of the innovations that we're seeing right now is autonomy. And at CARTS, we focus on 3 main pillars recently. One is autonomous vehicles research, one is urban design advocacy, and first and foremost, actually, is our direct community engagement initiatives. So, that's a brief description.
Great. Jasmine.
So hi everyone, my name is Yasmine Fage. I'm the CEO and co-founder of GoGo Network, not system, but almost. We focus on operating autonomous vehicle for delivery and transportation of people. Before that, I work also in transportation, but within McKinsey. And today, I think we want to speak a bit about the work and the trend we're seeing in Europe as a contrast also to what's happening in the US.
Great. And just a little bit about myself. I'm Lilian Corral. I'm with the Knight Foundation. I'm our Director of National Strategy and Technology Innovation. And we're a national foundation with local roots, primarily based in journalism. So how we got into the space is we really believe that people should be informed and engaged about the changes that are happening in their cities, especially tech-driven ones. And about 3 years ago, we started an initiative where in Knight communities where there was a lot of AV deployment or there was an energy around AV deployment, we wanted to see if we could try and engage the public and in those deployments and see if some of that engagement and feedback could have an impact on shaping the design of those pilots. We're also really trying to build capacity within government to do more deployments, to be more engaging, and to see what the future looks like. So I'm going to start with an interesting statistic that, Jerry, you brought to my attention, which is that in this industry, there's about $330 billion that's been assigned to R&D. But you talked, Jerry, about that there's a need to understand the demand for autonomous vehicles a little bit better. So tell us more about what you're seeing and why you don't think we understand the demand the way we need to.
Yep, sounds good. So the $330 billion is actually probably coming from one of your colleagues former colleagues at McKinsey, Yasmine. It's it's spent on the R&D and the supply and the provision of mobility side of the equation. In the ACES industries, which is autonomy, electrification, connected vehicles, and smart mobility. And by our estimate, I think about 200 billion alone has been spent on autonomy, just autonomous vehicle technologies. And as I mentioned, much of the money has been spent on the R&D, on the supply of mobility, where little discussion has been done on the demand side of mobility, the fundamental values of mobility, why humans need mobility, right? So at our work at CARTS, with our collaboration with the Princeton University as well, we focus a lot on the demand side. We try to understand what mobility is, where people want to go, and where people live, where people work. We simulated 1 billion daily trips in the United States for the 300 million United States residents. Just the basic question: origin, destination, time of day. Where do they live? Where do they want to go to work? Where they study? Where they have lunch breaks? Where they go to have happy hour drinks? Trying to understand on a micro personal level where people wanted to go, which is the demand of mobility. And on the more macro side, we also did a lot of research on the potential markets for the deployment of this technology. We focus on one statistics, which is the accessibility to vehicles or household vehicle ownership in the United States. So we actually made an interactive map of about 30,000 census county subdivisions, so places in the United States, based on the population density of people and households without access to vehicles. So these are the households with either zero vehicle ownership or multi-family households with only one vehicle ownership. We think the cities where there's a high density of population and households who don't have access to reliable transit or private vehicles are the ideal markets for robotaxis and autonomous shuttles to actually serve. This is the fundamental demand side of mobility, because to them, their option is either walking or get stuck at home, because they can not have access to other options. So that's really much of our focus is on trying to identify the demand of mobility.
That's great. So houses that lack access to vehicle and or high quality transit, those are the ones that we should be targeting. I'd love to hear from folks in the audience what you think about that. So Yasmine, you've been deploying a lot of autonomous vehicles and shuttles and delivery robots in Europe. Tell us about what you're seeing in terms of the different needs and perspectives on the demand side of this issue.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question, because it's important when we talk about autonomy and autonomous mobility also to differentiate the use cases, because actually from the different type of vehicle, speed, use case, it's kind of another word also. Is it, if it's like in private side, is it an open road? Is it with a maximum speed, minimum speed? So we know we tackled at the beginning, the vision of GoGo was very ambitious. SoftBank invested, so we said, okay, we're going to be the next robot taxi fleet in Europe. And then we realized, okay, robot taxi fleet is actually the most complicated use case you can ever think of, because you need to be able to have vehicles that go on average speed of like 40, 50 kilometers per hour. I mean, in European, whatever is miles, in almost any places or any of the city, and also to be in mixed traffic with other type of cars. So we said, okay, this is like an amazing quest, but let's think what are the other needs of mobility that we can serve in city in a maybe like shorter time frame. So we start looking at both the difference between, like, first, are we transporting people or are we transporting goods, right? Because when you transport goods, and we've seen the demand in increase in demand and last mile delivery, especially with the COVID crisis and so on. But like you kind of also simplify the problem, because then you don't have people inside that need a special style of driving, and you can also allow to have different type of size of vehicle that don't need to fit a human, right? So that's why we start operating sidewalk robots. So I think you've seen a couple here. We are not like a sidewalk robot company, but we work with a lot of sidewalk robots company for different type of use case, being food delivery or packages delivery. And we also worked with now like partnership with like larger type of vehicle to be able to transport like goods more in the Euro style type that can go from 15 to 20 kilometers per hour. And as I was saying before, when we're looking more at the people transportation, we also had the chance to work with shuttle companies, and we see that here that you can have different type of use cases being in private sites for corporation and airport and so on, or in public road to actually do this last mile, for instance, bringing people that don't have a car to the transportation, metro or bus that they need to have and that they would use if they could get there. So basically, like you remove car from the road.
And so what are the gaps that you're seeing? Because I think you have an insight into, as you're deploying, what I love about some of the work that we've been doing is that I feel like we're learning as we're deploying. And I think one of the challenges is we're not deploying enough, so we're not able to really learn in real time. What are you learning in real time about the gaps that are missing in order to reach this autonomy vision that everybody wants?
No, for sure, gaps we are noticing a lot. I would say, like, first of all, like in Europe, and it's where we're a little bit like facing more challenges compared to the US, is like we have a complicated regulatory systems, and so we need to work country by country, almost city by city. And for instance, the regulation that is there in Miami to operate in any place of Miami, sidewalk robots and so on, in Europe we are right now working with regulators to be able to do so. So there's one of the challenge, but also an opportunity to be able to shape this regulatory framework. Other challenges that we see in some cities is actually like the infrastructure, right? Like some cities have like very small roads or sidewalks and so on. So how do you adjust to that compared to like, let's say, newer countries or newer cities that have a much more like geometrical, stable infrastructure? And then I would say like the challenge that everybody is expecting to be people, how would people react? At the deployment that we had, actually, what we saw is that people are actually very excited by the opportunity. We didn't see any like vandalism or any like passive-aggressive behavior with autonomous vehicles. So I would say like in terms of like people acceptation and acceptance, we've seen like positive trends.
Yeah, I was going to ask more. I mean, like going back to the demand point of view, like how are people reacting, and how are they integrating this, Yasmine, into their lives? Can you talk a little bit about? Can you just talk a little bit more about how people are integrating the vehicles into their own like daily lives and into their own transit patterns?
Yeah, so I think in terms of delivery, for instance, the goal is for people to have a seamless experience, that they shouldn't like feel that they have actually like a delivery done by a sidewalk robot or by another type. It should be more that they order the food and then they just received an icon that would say it will be delivered by a robot. So the difference is that they have to maybe go down and pick up the food, but it should be seamless. But for instance, when we deploy like more like a, let's say, autonomous vending machine of food, we wanted to test the use case of what would happen if you had like cars that would move around at slow speed, but that would distribute food that you can have like more like a vending machine. Then you're like, we saw, you know, people that would go naturally, like we wouldn't expect, but like use the card and pay at any age, and they would just see it as a way to not have to go to like a further food option. So they just integrate that as it becomes more convenient for them.
So there's a natural question on, do we need this? Sorry, this is sort of like, I mean, what are you seeing as like the real value to cities around this? Like, do we actually need a lot of this technology, and how are people expressing that when they're interacting with it? I'll throw that to to either of you if you have it.
I mean, maybe super quickly, and then Jerry, you should complement. But I think at the end of the day, what we're seeing, and it's even more maybe obvious in European cities that are smaller and crowded, is that right now the way the cities are organized makes absolutely no sense. Like, it belongs to like car, it's polluted, there is traffic. People, are in pollution, and like if we could find like not huge van delivery, but like much more seamless vehicle that would go electric and do the same work. And we're seeing that this is what's happening because like in Barcelona, in Paris, in Berlin, like more and more like city center are becoming like exclusive to large car and like looking for more like electric option, then it come like a natural like conclusion that you need to be able to deploy those. So it's a need that solve like how can you be in a more like sustainable city that belongs to people instead of belonging to cars.
Yeah. Jerry, any thoughts on that?
Yep. I think you brought a very good question, which is what are some of the gaps right now? And I think community has been a huge gap in the planning of many of those initiatives, except for the ones at Knight Foundation, of course. And community is market. Market is community. It's real mobility need, as I mentioned before. In many of the places where this technology has been either tested or deployed, there might not be enough need or demand for this mobility, for this kind of mobility, because they are being deployed at places where auto ownership is already very high, and for someone to give up their private vehicle ready for them 24 hours in their backyard to a robo-taxi service, I think that's going to be a tremendous behavioral change. And you have to build a really, really, really great robo-taxi service to be able to serve those customers. But again, in terms of the demand and need, I would say in about 80 or 90% of American cities, so basically all the big and medium-sized cities, except for New York, DC, Chicago, maybe Seattle, I think there's a big portion of population that do not have access to vehicles, to reliable transit. Not every city has a 24-hour subway system like New York. And in one of the projects that we're heavily involved, which is Trenton Moves, for example, the 90,000 people in Trenton makes about 300,000 trips on average per day. Many of them are stuck. There's no sizable, grocery store in Trenton. There's no Walmart in Trenton. There's not even a Wawa in Trenton. And for the people who don't have vehicles, they are stuck. They cannot even get to groceries. They cannot go to their doctor's appointment. The paratransit services doesn't really work. Our beloved New Jersey Transit doesn't really work in Trenton that well compared to transporting people to Manhattan. And there is tremendous need for and we see, autonomous mobility as really this sort of Ford Model T moment. I guess that's a analogy overuse that really can help achieve the scalable deployment of mobility. It's the value. Fundamentally, it's safety, of course. We believe autonomous mobility is safe. They will be safer, if not now, maybe in 10 years. They will be much safer than human drivers, definitely better than me. But also, it's the scalability. It's the Moore's law. It's the affordability that's really going to help us achieve providing mobility for all, because
and it's also just the fact that it's public data that there are not enough truck drivers for the future for trucks. There's not even like enough bus driver. A lot of like bus lane are like not operated because they're not profitable, or because so it's just like there's also a natural like tendency for the population to not want to do those jobs. And you need to find like alternative. And I think there's a question of access. So how can you bring, access to people? But it's also a question of like giving time back to people, because at the end of the day, even if you have a car, if you can do something else with your 1 hour transit, like working, relaxing, and giving that back to like a personal or economical use instead of being like stuck doing nothing else and driving, it's also bringing to society, I think, a lot of like at the end economic return and positivity.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't work in the mobility space full time, and in that outside world, people are always wondering like, what's the real need for this autonomous vehicle? Is it just a shiny object? And I think what you're both describing are real situations right now where an autonomous vehicle could actually solve a problem, but you're not, or an autonomous shuttle could solve a problem, but we're not actually meeting the need and the demand. And so I think that's a really interesting question to like throw back to all of us or all of you in the audience who are in in the industry. So kind of just keeping an eye on time. So what should the transit system in the 21st century look like with that demand, piece in mind? Jerry, or
if I may, jump in. I'm very glad that you asked the question about transit, the wording of transit, because our understanding of transit. I mean, everybody has a different understanding of transit, but in the case of our the project that we're working on, Trenton Moves, to quote Governor Murphy of New Jersey, Trenton Moves is going to be the first autonomous vehicle-based urban transit system in America. And it's transit because it's transporting people, do it for you from A to B. Traditionally, it's been, like subway or fixed route bus systems. But as I mentioned before, I think 80% of American cities, probably the fixed route option probably doesn't work because the temporal and spatial distribution of human mobility in the city is just so scattered that it has to be on demand. That's also why so many people choose to get a car instead, of course. But I believe transit in 21st century will be on demand, and to achieve this vision of on-demand transit, I think autonomy is key because autonomy makes it safe, and it's the only way to keep it affordable and financially sustainable on the cost side, not on the price side. So we are envisioning, for example, for Trenton Moves to be fully financially sustainable just by the market rate within 3 or 4 years, without any subsidy.
Okay. And then, Yasmine, you and I had a conversation about how all of the autonomy does force some change in behavior and habits. What does that change look like for people? And what is your vision of that 21st century transit system?
Yeah, no, I think, as I was saying, if you give people the opportunity to actually not have to worry about, let's say, transit to work, which is actually 80% of the transit that everyone does, you can think of how it can impact even like real estate, right? And where you want to live, because being able to just be in a car and working or doing something productive and not having to think I have to live close to work, change just real estate habits. It can also change we gave some example, but giving back access to people to transit when they don't have that option also can bring a lot of people back to work or to other activities that they couldn't. And I'm not just talking about disabled people, which of course is one population, but just people that were deprived access to transportation and how you can reintegrate them into the system. And I think at the end of the day, it's also more about how cities can look like, right? And how you can be in a city while having your food and your good delivered without having huge truck station in front of where you live. You can go to one place to another in a seamless, maybe shared shuttle way without having everybody their own car where they are alone and using a huge space in the street. It's just at the end of the day being able to be in a world that I think works much more seamlessly and beautifully. And now, because this is the heritage of the past of 60 years that we all are used to have our own car, it's a kind of social prestige and all of this, we are with this mentality and mindset. But I think this is evolving when you think that more than half of the people in San Francisco don't have a driving license anymore. It just also gives a sense of where we're all going.
Yeah. So we have just a little bit of time. Does anybody in the audience have questions for the panelists? Any questions? Oh, yeah. Nice.
Hi, good afternoon. One thing that I have been waiting to sort of hear more on, perhaps throughout the whole conference, but particularly here, is as you guys are thinking about how this is going to reshape communities, and in particular that certainly driving jobs, transport jobs, et cetera, perhaps are not always the most desirable. However, they are highly valuable to many of the people and communities that work them. And so I am curious how you guys are thinking about the evolution of workforce, skills base, et cetera, when you're thinking about that particular link to communities and how that can be transformative economically. I don't know where the jobs are in autonomous vehicles, so could someone please explain that to me?
Yeah. Do you guys want to take?
Yeah. No, sure. It's a very good question, and it's a question that, of course, is always asked and always very, let's say, emotional. But it's at the end of the day, what is interesting is that when you look at autonomous driving and operating an autonomous shuttle or car, you realize that you're creating much more, let's say, you're creating higher skill job in the engineering team, but you're also creating a lot of operation null jobs, because the maintenance of an autonomous truck, an autonomous car, is actually much more complex than a normal vehicle. So let's say you're transitioning, let's say, driving, pure driver jobs into operations and engineering, and then also monitoring and supervision of the whole platform and data system. And actually, if you're interested in the topic, the United Nations has been a lot of reports actually studying how, which job will disappear and what would be created. And it's, I think, out of maybe 5 studies, it's always more jobs that are created. So it's just a transition, and it's important to have governments be aware of that and help train, so that this is a transition that happens in the community. But I don't think we should be scared of that transition.
Yeah, and using our work with the Trenton Moves, for example, I think it's gonna directly and indirectly support and create a lot of jobs. Many people in Trenton, unfortunately, there's one Amazon warehouse 15 minutes away by driving outside of Trenton. The people, some of the folks that we talked to who wanted to take that $15 per hour warehouse job cannot get there on time, because he or she has to take the bus, transfer it downtown, taking 2 hours, wake up at 4 a.m. where there's no bus, and she will miss her job. Or she can spend $50 round trip taking an Uber or Lyft, go to work. But with Trenton Moves, services like Trenton Moves, it can directly support, bring access to jobs, to many jobs for the folks in Trenton. And also directly, the initiative, it's huge in scale. We're aiming to bring 100 autonomous vehicles to Trenton, the 8 square miles of Trenton. So directly, this initiative is going to create a lot of jobs. In the initial years, there will be safety hosts as well. And once the safety hosts certify the operational design domain of Trenton, they will be invited to expand the ODD to the Mercer County, which we think is probably the first proof of market opportunity for this industry, because Mercer County in general, including places like Princeton itself, Hamilton, Ewen, there's a huge mobility demand, and it's really the sizable market for autonomous mobility. And to go back to the old elevator analogy, we think autonomous mobility as a service are just like driverless elevators, but horizontally, right? If you do a survey right now, probably there will be 50,000 elevator operators existing right now in the world, maybe in the United States. After the elevator strike in New York in the mid-20th century, many elevator operators went out of job. But think about the transition of this technology and how many jobs driverless elevators created in New York, how many jobs these office towers, these residential buildings actually created. This is the kind of the indirect job creation that, that's kind of analogous to our horizontal elevators.
Yeah. I do think it's a great question, and I think we have to put a pin on, at least in the American context, America does not do workforce development really well, and I do think we have to think about workforce development and retraining in this 10, 20-year period as we're trying to move into more autonomous technology, period, not just vehicles or otherwise. And I also think, I'll put a pin on this, I think this is why it's so important to have these conversations not just within this technology space where there's startup entrepreneurs, investors, and enthusiasts alike, but also with some of the regulators, this is a real issue, and we have to address the changing needs of the workforce in a more holistic way if we're gonna also go at it. We have 16, 15 seconds left. 3 key takeaways for you from these two panelists. What do you guys want to, like, Jerry, what's the one key takeaway you want to give the audience?
10. Can I say 10?
10? Go, 1 second.
If I'll squeeze 2 together.
Okay.
One is community, fundamentally, and I thank CoMotion for actually putting this topic front and center in your conference this year. I think it's fundamentally important. It's the pillar that's been missing from most of the discussion in the industry, and I think public sector, industry, and community have to work together. And us coming from a nonprofit and academic background, we are very lucky to be able to bring these pillars together. And again, community is demand, community is market. So I would squeeze in the focus on demand as well, because it's really by, only by engaging with the community directly can you understand what the real demand is. So that's the work that we're doing, and that's the work that we hope the industry can focus more on in the future.
Okay, and maybe very quickly for me, and that's been a personal learning, is really when we say autonomy, just trying to understand what is behind this word, because it's like another universe, and how you can actually like narrow down use case that makes sense today, that will make sense in 2 years, and that will make sense in 10 years, and how do you get to work and start operating what can be done today with the constraint of regulation, technology, and infrastructure environments. And I think Jerry said it, but at the end of the day, the other, for me, big takeaway is that as you create a new industry, it can only work if private and public sector work together, because you're kind of creating, everything, new job, new way of everything, and it needs to be seamlessly integrated between the two players.
Yeah. Well, I'll just close by saying this was kind of by luck that I joined this panel, but we at Knight Foundation believe that a smart city is only as smart as its people, and people, the community, have to be engaged in the deployment of new technology. It's not going to work. I think Salita Reynolds talked about it yesterday morning. What's going to happen is cities are going to react very negatively when something goes wrong. And so in order for all of this to be successful, we've got to engage the public. We've got to understand that real demand, and then meet it with strong innovation and investment. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time. And thank you both for such wonderful insights.
Thank you.